Okay, well, so ever since I've submitted this paper to the conference, there has been a bit of the change in the topic and title of this presentation. It's a natural thing that happens when you write papers, I think. So the title I thought to be more proper would be Semantic Pressure by Mind Perception in AI. So let's get into details. So we use mental terms such that like beliefs, desire, or sometimes value-driven terms like responsibility or pity to explain human behaviors. It's very typical of expressing this kind of terms to explain how other people act, or it's very common for us to say that I feel pity for him, something like that. Interestingly, a similar phenomena have been happening in the domain of AI. In other words, people perceive mind in AI, which means that people use psychological attitude, such as belief, to explain AI's behavior, or people say as if AI robots has desires, or people even sometimes say that I feel pity for a cyborg, or I think that AI driver must have some sort of responsibility for the accident, something like that. In sum, there's a mind perception in AI that, as unexpected, essentially non-anthropocentric uses of mental concepts. So the primary question that I'm trying to bring up in this presentation is this: are these people, the ordinary people, are they literally including AI systems in the proper extension of mental concepts? So by AI systems, I mean in a very broad sense, social robots or chatbots or what have you, anything that has AI in it. And by mental concepts, I mean in a broad sense, psychological attitudes like belief, desire, decide, what have you, including moral terms like responsibility. So what does people mean when they say that, for instance, I think that robot desires to be recharged? What do they mean by saying that I feel pity for that cyborg? So I'm going to first introduce relevant experiments in social studies and philosophical studies, and then clarify what I mean by semantic elements. And then I'm going to move on to interpreting the referential changes, how to interpret this referential changes. So I'm going to go through several possible way of interpreting the way in which people use this concept, mental concepts in the domain of AI. And as you can see, the last view, namely literalism, is the view that I accept. And then lastly, I'm going to discuss some implications of my presentation as some sort of conceptual changes happening regarding mental concepts. So let's begin with going through some specific relevant experiments. So as I've just said, people perceive mind in AI, and people treat AIs as persons. For instance, according to Schenk et al., they have discovered that people showed very strong emotional response like extraordinary outcomes, so if they behave like human beings. Similarly, Hubner have conducted several experiments showing that individuals ascribe beliefs and pain to an AI cyborg. In the vignette, the AI cyborg is described as a human likely acting robot that do not have the brain, but people still ascribe mental capacities to those AI robots. And I guess some of you might have seen this video clip. This is the robot dog Spot. And as you can see, people are sort of harassing, kicking this robot. And some of you might feel that they should not do that, or you might feel that I feel pity for this Ava, this robot, this Spot. And according to Word et al., when intentional harm is given to a AI robot, people more tend to have mind perception. That is, if they see that AI robot is being harmed, they more likely to describe the AI's behaviors in mentalistic terms, in mental terms, mental concepts. And most surprisingly, the way in which people ascribe mental concepts to AI robots is not restricted by the appearances of AI robots. In other words, it doesn't really matter whether AI robots has the appearances similar to human beings, because some people even ascribe like emotions to AI cleaning robots. So there's a dissociation between mind perception and human-like appearances. Or even if the AI robots do not exhibit any sort of social behaviors, people still count them, can still count them as sort of mental beings. So as I've said in the first slide, what to make of this kind of this use of mental terms in this non-human domain? How should they interpret? What do they mean by this? So that is to say, when people try to explain AI robots' behavior first, they ascribe psychological attitudes to explain AI's behavior, such that the AI home cleaning robot decides to clean the room, the social robot wants to be recharged, or sometimes people even use social and or moral concepts to AI, such that you should not harm Spot, or if you see this robot dog Ivo is harnessed, you might feel that I feel pity for Ivo, something like that. Or sometimes people say that the AI driver is responsible for the car accident. So what is the proper interpretation of such unexpected, non-anthropocentric uses of mental concepts? So this is the question that I'm trying to indulge in this presentation. So, okay. Since because of the time limit, I'm going to skip this interpretation. Okay, let's get into the second one, so-called the ignorance view. According to Turkle, when people ascribe mind to AI robots, they depend on they are in fact dependent upon some sort of similarities between AI and human, which pushes Darwinian buttons that trigger certain psychological responses. So what does Turkle mean by this Darwinian button? One of the most familiar example some of you might have seen is Hyder and Zimmel's illusion. I'm pretty much sure that some of you must have seen this. Just try to observe the behavior of these geometric figures. So when you watch this video, you might feel that that big triangle is angry. So you're ascribing emotions to this triangle. Or you might say that, you might feel that the things that it's doing, something like moral ascription is being made. That's what Turkle means by pushing Darwinian buttons. There are some aspects that makes us to feel some sort of emotions or moral emotions to be triggered simply by watching things. And Turkle says that applications of mental terms to AI emerged from ignorance concerning the ontological status of AI qua person. So when people use mental terms to explain or describe AI's behaviors, they're making some sort of a misperception-based explanation. They should not do so if they were smart enough, so to speak. So according to this ignorance view, what people are denoting by the referential changes from the human domain to AI domain are their emotional states, but not AI per se. So they do not literally mean that AI feels or believes or desire. So what's the problem of this ignorance view? First is that uses of mental concepts in the relevant situation are too fine-grained to be accounted simply by the ignorance view. So let me unpack this by referring to some relevant experiments. So Paracelsus experiments concerns this case of psychological attitudes, mainly belief in desires. So they showed a video clip. This is a robot called ICAIH, and he asked people to describe ICAIH's behaviors in ways they would like to, and they found that there's a correlation between individuals' expectations regarding capacities of this ICAIH and the tendency to use psychological terms in their explanations. In other words, if a participant has a high expectation, if they have some sort of prior beliefs that AI will act or can act like a human beings, then it is highly likely that they will use terms like desire, feel, belief in explaining behaviors ICAIH. On the other hand, if a participant has low expectation of AI robots' capacities, saying that they do not really think that AIs can really act like a human beings, then they rather use non-psychological, purely mechanistic terms to explain behaviors of ICAIH, which indicates that people do not simply refer to their emotional states, but rather their use of mental concepts in explaining behaviors of AI robots deeply connected to their prior beliefs in or their information about capacities of AIs. So it's not really simply emotions or their ignorance that makes us to use mentalistic terms to explain AI robots. Rather, they have, at least implicitly, rely on how they conceive of the capacities of AI robots in using the terms in the domain of AI. A different experiment that I would like to bring up is Hans and Lima et al.'s studies regarding moral agency. So according to these studies, participants attribute punishment and responsibility to this AI driver, but not psychological attitudes. So they asked whether people would take AI drivers causing a car accident as blameworthy action. And it turns out that participants willingly to say that that AI driver is responsible for the car accident. On the other hand, they were hesitant to say that AI drivers have beliefs or desires or etc., which means that there's a very dissociation between attributing moral agency from ascribing psychological attitudes in people's mind perception in AI. In other words, people make some sort of very deliberative, thoughtful processes before determining whether to ascribe certain mental concepts to a type of AI, which means the ignorance view fails. Well, a second view that I would like to talk about is the mindless view. In order to understand mindless view, we should understand the distinction between mindfulness and mindlessness proposed by Langer. So mindfulness, as stated here, the individual is implicitly aware of the context and the content of information. And mindlessness is that the individual overly rely on categories and distinctions drawn in the past and is oblivious to novel aspects of the information. So keep this distinction in your memory, and then move on to the actual mindless view proposed by Noh and Moon. According to this, according to them, so mind perception in AI, well, they rather use computers rather than the term AI, but for the sake of argument, I'll replace the term computer with AI. Mind perception in AI is the result of people's mindlessly applying social rules and expectations to AIs. So according to them, people non-deliberatively, without considering the categorical shift from the human domain to non-human domain, they apply mental concepts by being exposed to certain cues. So what do they mean by cues? It's better to get into some detailed example of their study. So let's look into their case study for politeness. Politeness is a typical social script that we can find in human-human relationship. For example, if a speaker says, "How do you like my new haircut?" We have very strong social tendency. We are biased towards to say some sort of polite answer, such that saying it looks wonderful. So even if we think that the speaker's new haircut sucks, it's like we cannot help ourselves with saying that it looks wonderful. That's what Noh and Moon said by some sort of cues elicited our social script. Interestingly, this kind of eliciting of social script is observed in case where human-computer relationship takes place. So a participant were looking into a computer screen, and this computer A asked this participant with some shape, maybe a picture of someone on the screen saying that, "How do you like my new haircut?" Well, of course, the participant knows that the computer is just a computer. There's no person behind it. And they conducted a series of interviews. And first, the participant were asked to answer to that computer A, and then to the other computer B, and then they write down the answer on a paper. Surprisingly, when the participants were asked to type down the answer directly to the computer A, the researchers found that the politeness significantly increases comparing to other two cases, which means that the social cue, trying to be polite is sometimes triggers social script, even in case where human-computer relationship takes place. So the mindless view holds that what people are denoting by referential change, the referential change are social scripts for human-human interaction, which are typically elicited when they are exposed to certain cues. So what's the problem of this mindless view? One is, in many experiments, mind perception occurs even when relevant cues are missing. So for instance, in Song et al.'s experiments, people ascribe emotions to this home cleaning AI robot. where the home cleaning AI robot has no exhibition of any sort of cues relevant to social script. So cues are not seem to be some sort of necessary condition for mind perception in AIs. Secondly, people are often fully aware of mind perception in AI, which means that the mindless view presuppose that when people perceive mind in AI, they are not really aware of the fact that they are ascribing mental concepts to the AIs. But in many studies that I've cited so far, the participants are explicitly asked they need to consider the case for the AIs, and they were asked to evaluate AI's behaviors, whether they would use mental terms or not. Most importantly, context under which mind perception occurs are not really captured by differences between social scripts. So let's look into a kind of social script involved by a cue, role of reciprocity. So we have this kind of role. One should provide help, favors, and benefits to those who have previously helped them. So for instance, if you get help from one of your friend A, then you feel like obliged to pay back that help. You feel obliged to help that friend A in response to being helped. So that's what I mean by role of reciprocity. Surprisingly, there's a counter experiment performed shows that this kind of social script cannot really explain human AI interaction. So Shin refers a relevant experiment. So Shin's experiment goes like this. She has discovered that participants use the moral concepts such as pity reflects their distinction between different types of AIs. By different types, that she used this economist robot and a social robot. So the experiment goes like this. For the participants were given a series of vignettes. Vignette one says that you are being helped by a economist robot. For instance, this robot helps you to make more money in the stock markets, something like that. And in another context, another situation, you're now being helped by a social robot like this Aibo, that this Aibo robot is playing with you, giving you a lot of fun, etc., etc. And okay, now situation has been changed into in the first condition. Now the vignette is given says the participant is now seeing that this economist robot is being harmed. And under the other situation, the participant is now reading the vignette saying that this social robot is now being harmed. So the question is, would you ascribe moral patiency? That is, would you say that either or both of the robots are being morally condemned or morally harassed, something like that? Would you use moral terms to explain what is being done to this robot and this robot? Surprisingly, people used terms like pity to explain social robots being harmed, but they did not use the term pity to explain this economist robots being harmed, which indicates that when people use mental terms, mentalistic terms, or mental concepts, they make a careful consideration about what type of AI robots they are dealing with, so as to determine whether they should use the terms like pity to explain this given situation, which means that it's not just a mindless ascription of mental terms, but rather it involves some sort of a making considerations before they are trying to use the terms. So, okay, let me wrap up. So what I'm proposing here is that the proper interpretation of the referential changes is the literalist view. In other words, people are literally including AIs in the extension of mental concepts. So what should we make of this kind of interpretation? What is the implication of this interpretation? Well, according to Wittgenstein and Kokelberg, semantic roles are not fixed, and semantic roles are manifested as the outcome of the process of relation and interaction. So semantic roles are in fact something that reveals itself in terms of the interactions we make with other human beings or things in the world. So what I'm trying to say here is the non-anthropocentric referential changes that we have seen through in this slides in uses of mental terms are cases for semantic pressure, according to which the proper extensions of mental concepts need to be extended to include AI as the terms are used in human domains. So in other words, we are now living in the era where the very referential meaning of mental concepts is now being changed to include AIs as its proper extension of the concepts. Thank you very much.